Welcome to the Everyday Citizens Tactical Podcast, Episode 37, Hurricane Helene. My name is Jeremy, and as always, I will be your host. Today I'm joined by Nick, better known as the Sicilian on Instagram, who is a native to Western North Carolina and played an active role in helping his community during the massive emergency that struck the heart of Southern Appalachia. So, sit back and take notes as we dive into this informal after action on Hurricane Helene.
Tell me turn it down and I'ma only turn up louder. Call me what you wanna, but you can't call me no coward. Strength in numbers, we the people, still the ones with power. Fighting fire with fire, time to take back what is ours. Tell me turn it down and I'ma only turn up louder. Call me what you wanna, but you can't call me no coward. Strength in numbers, we the people, still the ones with power. Fighting fire with fire, time to take back what is ours.
Welcome back to the podcast, everybody, and Nick, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me on, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, obviously, you were kind of in the, pretty much in the thick of it as far as the damage to the Appalachians from Hurricane Helene and, being a North Carolina, native yourself. So for those that don't know you, you want to go ahead and kind of give a little spiel and introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Nick. I am the Sicilian on Instagram and on Twitter. But yeah, just kind of started out the page a couple years ago with some general preparedness stuff in mind, kind of wanting to document my journey more so as a student opposed to a subject matter expert, and, kind of getting into preparedness, getting into guns, getting into all of that fun stuff. But yeah, been in North Carolina for the better part of my life. I was born here, lived here most of my life, Western North Carolina specifically over the past 10 or 15 years. And yeah, been a really crazy time in Appalachian history and Western North Carolina history. A lot of really kind of odd things going on with the hurricane. So, but that's just a little bit about me.
I know it's like a running joke at this point about living through, a life-changing event every single week of our life right now, but I definitely did not have the Appalachian Mountains flooding on my Bingo card.
No, I didn't either. I just want the once-in-a-lifetime events to stop. If that could happen, I'd be a lot better off, but it's really, really unexpected. I mean, we see every year Florida, islands, in the Caribbean, Cuba, a bunch of areas like that getting flooded or getting hit with hurricanes. Last thing I expected was for, Western North Carolina and Eastern Tennessee to get hit as hard as they did,
So, I mean, just for everybody that doesn't live in this area and has never been to kind of Appalachia as a whole, I mean, what do you think really even caused this type of disaster? Was it just, I mean, because I'm, a few hours north of you in a different part of Appalachia, but was it just
Right.
how dry everything was and then the massive amount of rain? Like what caused this, do you think?
It's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. As I don't think that there's any historical precedent for there being a hurricane coming this deep into the country and into Appalachia. I don't think that's ever happened before. I know that the only other flood in my area that was anywhere close was in 1916.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as what actually caused it, I've got absolutely no idea. It could be that it's been dry, throughout the summer down here in North Carolina. I think that one of the other big things, and I'm sure we'll dive into it more later on, is that North Carolina doesn't have the infrastructure for a hurricane, the same way that somewhere like Florida does.
Mm-hmm.
So, as far as being unprepared for a hurricane, I think that North Carolina is probably one of the least prepared states for something like that to happen, or at least in this area. We're used to having them, on the coast, but to have the infrastructure overwhelmed the way that we did, just by sheer 24 inches of water being dumped, across a 3-day period,
Mm-hmm.
it's really kind of unprecedented.
And I had read and or listened to some experts kind of talking about how this storm kind of worked, and I'm no expert on the matter, but essentially it was summed up by the hurricane itself was so large, area mass wise. It was a very wide storm. And we were
Right.
kind of in this awkward period where early onset of cold temperatures was already hitting the northern part of the United States and Canada. So essentially, once the storm kind of got up north of Cincinnati, so you start moving into Ohio, which is, just north of where I live, the
Right.
storm where it was warm weather and had all of this concentrated, precipitation hit this very like heavy cold front because the temperature differences were 30 or something degrees, where northern Ohio it's already 45 degrees at, but it's still 80 degrees here in Kentucky and in Tennessee and so on and so forth. And it essentially like stopped the storm in its tracks and basically just trapped all of this rain over Appalachia, which is again is a once in a lifetime thing. It's not a common thing that occurs like this because the temperature differences normally aren't that big. But that's how it was
Right.
explained to me. It makes sense if you think about how tornadoes normally work in the spring between the cooler winter temperatures going away and the warmer spring temperatures coming in. So that's kind of how it was made sense to me. I don't know how much truth there is to that exactly.
Yeah, I'd not heard that before, and that does make total sense as far as the differential, in temperatures, and that making it stop further up there, and then it being a little bit warmer down here, so it had more to feed off of, I guess. But yeah, really, really wild.
So, I guess the first big question is just like, at what point did you realize how bad the flooding and the rain had come on? I mean, was it just the blink of an eye and it's like, oh shit, it's now flooding? Or was it kind of like a slow onset where it's like, this is going to get kind of worse?
A little bit of both. So, kind of moving along the timeline, it had been pouring the whole week, Monday through Friday. And it was a little bit lighter on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I was working on Thursday and had, we were doing work in the rain. We weren't too worried about it, but it started coming down heavier. And got done with work at about 5 or something, and was like, I'm gonna head home. And I was really driving back and was like, man, this is awfully thick rain. Like, this is a lot of rain. It's coming down really heavy. It's having a lot of visibility issues. And so I was like, that's really odd. We don't tend to have this happen, this late into the year. That tends to happen a lot more in the summer. But got home Thursday, kind of hunkered down, was like, the power's probably going to go out. So grab some candles, grab a flashlight, all of that good stuff. And just, kind of hunkered down for the night. And then, the power went out late on Thursday. And I was like, that's fine. It'll probably come back on, by the morning. And so got up Friday morning and it's still pouring down rain. I was like, damn, this is really, really something. And so power's still down. And the first that I noticed that it was, that something was off, that it wasn't just a run of the mill storm, was that I walked down my driveway and I had 2 giant pines laying in my driveway. I was like, oh, this is something. Now at the same time, I'm losing cell service on Friday morning. And so was trying to, call family, touch base, see how they were doing. And it just, super, super slow internet. And then it got to the point to where I didn't have any cell service at all. So I'm walking up and down my road and there's probably 24 trees down, in the 3 or 4 miles, of my road. So walked all the way down to it, and there are about a dozen trees, that are going to have to get cleared before I could get out onto the main road. So that was kind of the first inkling that I got that things were, that the scale was different than I thought it was. And so the combination of not having cell service, being, blocked in at home, and it's still raining, was kind of the first thing that, that tipped off that it was bigger than normal. And then by about Sunday was the first opportunity that I had to leave my house, to get out and to get somewhere else. And I got cell service back on Sunday, and I, started seeing all of these reports of, Hurricane Helene, what a travesty, what a massive event, and then I was like, oh, this is national headlines. Like, this is totally different. So that was kind of the first inkling that I got was on Friday, and then larger understanding came on Sunday.
Sure. So I mean, essentially, you went Friday and Saturday with no comms outside of whoever your neighbors happened to be.
Yeah, which I know my neighbors. My neighbors are great people, and so we wound up having about a dozen, eight to 10 guys who were out, in droves with tractors, with chainsaws, cutting stuff down, getting stuff out of the way, going down the road to help other folks who were dealing with the same thing. But yeah, there really wasn't any communication other than my neighbors for the better part of 2 days.
What was so unique, I think, about this storm, and this goes for both the Tennessee affected areas and the North Carolina affected areas, is that normally when you have storms, they're a lot more kind of focused around a very small geographical area. It's normally not this widespread. So if cell phone towers or something goes down in that small area, you still get kind of the remnants of the surrounding area to where you still get some sort of cell and internet services.
Correct.
But this was so wide that it essentially just blacked out everybody until Sunday, kind of Monday rolled around, where more footage was coming out, more cries for help were coming out. Because Friday, I remember because just sitting at the firehouse at the end of that week, I worked Thursday and Friday. And, I'm thinking about, what did the storm do? And it didn't seem like very pressing because you didn't hear a ton. You heard that things were bad, but like there wasn't a lot of videos up. You didn't hear from a lot of people. So it was like, might not be that bad. But then like Sunday hit and everyone's like, whoa, what happened type kind of reaction.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the story that I've gotten from everyone, at least in my area, that, everyone kind of was trying to wait it out and see how bad things were going to be. And then losing, cell service, losing that literal connection with other people, the scale of it all was not known at that time by most people, is what it seems like. So it's definitely odd to really feel like, okay, well, we're stepping back to the 1800s. We're trying to get the tractors out here and get the trees cut, and there's no cell service, there's no power. So it was definitely an odd experience, literally having the most useless block sitting in your front pocket, trying to call people, and it's just not working.
One other interesting thing, just as far as comms go, was how this storm affected repeaters. Because in a lot of areas where there was like large landslides and just true landscape damage, repeaters were put out of service. And especially in like the Appalachia areas, as you know. And for those that are listening, like, and don't have a giant understanding of how comms works, the hills and dense forests like really mess up comms. So if you take out area repeaters, you don't have comms. And we put so much focus from like the preparedness perspective on, everybody has at least a portable radio that's properly programmed to have your area repeaters. That way, if there's a disaster, everybody can at least hop on their repeater and talk to each other. Regardless of how upset the hams and the FUDs on radio operators might be. But in those areas, like the majority of the repeaters were down. Like you didn't have comms outside of your basic line of sight.
Correct. Yeah. We, I've got, my local guys that we don't really post about it, but, all of us are kind of like, if something happens, we've got a working plan, or at least, the bones of a plan. And one of those things is comms, and comms weren't working. So it's definitely, I'm not the biggest radio guy. I don't invest as much time as I should into it. That's more than likely going to change after this. But, yeah, it was really weird because you kind of go through that PACE, acronym, and you got your primary, and that's obviously your cell phone, and then your alternate would be a radio, and that's not working. And so the one thing that I do know that actually was working to some degree were like Garmin inReaches. That people were able to ping each other off of those or message each other off of them. And those are the only thing that I've heard that did not lose connection through the entire time. So
I know one of my very best friends who's in the Marine Corps with me, went to high school with me, his wife's family lives right outside Asheville, and I've been to their house before driving back and forth from base. And the only way that she was able to contact her family was through a satellite phone, because just one of them happened to have a satellite phone.
Yeah.
Other than that, they had no internet, no cell service for, I want to say, till probably Tuesday morning, maybe Wednesday, somewhere like it
Yeah.
was like 4 or 5 days before just normal communication started to open back up.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I just use cellular data for essentially everything, and that's probably not the best thing to put out on the internet. But it's I'm very aware of where my coverage is and where my coverage isn't. I'm on the road for a substantial portion of my job, and able to know that I'm going to lose service up here in about a mile, or once I go around this turn, I'm not going to have it until I get to this other point. And the kind of the map that I have of that coverage totally shifted and totally changed, and it's only now getting back to normal. So whatever cell coverage there is, I would imagine was brought in with those emergency cell stations that they're able to hook up and stuff. But really, really odd to not be able to have communication with the outside world for 2 days, at least for me. I know that for other people it was longer, it was shorter, but it's definitely reminder of how fragile the system is.
I mean, it just goes back to things you see people talk about on Instagram and everything all the time, is that when the shit goes down, you have whoever is within walking distance of you, and that may not be your super cool guy tactical group of prepper guys that are spread out over 2 or 3 counties. It could just be Bob and his 16-year-old son that live a quarter mile from you. Like, that could be all you have.
Yep.
So
it was, and thankfully I've got a good Bob. I know my neighbors, they're good folks. So the first thing that I did Friday morning was, get up, kind of evaluate the situation, and start knocking door to door. Hey, are you guys in good shape? Is there anything that you need? Okay, if not, gonna go start clearing trees. And that's an awfully nice thing to have. Not everybody has that, but that's one big thing that if people can kind of take away from all of this, it's know the people around you. I never would have thought that I would be stuck at home, for 2 days at the start of a disaster, or at the start of, some type of cataclysmic event. But I was, and thankfully knowing your neighbors definitely makes everything easier.
I mean, it kind of goes back to the old saying of, as much as we kind of take a shit on Baofangs and how fragile they are and how not super useful they are for a lot of scenarios. I mean, just having a box of handout Baofangs can be pretty useful to just talk to your neighbors that live on your street when literally all of their comms are down, and now you're all just having working parties in the street, essentially.
Yeah.
But so kind of take us down the timeline even further. So it's now Sunday. You're just now starting to get cell phone service back, and you've finally kind of made it off your road. What kind of happens next for you?
Yeah, so the first thing that happened on Sunday, and what kind of facilitated me getting out, was that I had gotten a phone call. And so it had been 2 days since I had heard my phone make a single noise, and this was at probably 6:37 in the morning, and it was my best friend Matt. And so he called, and he and his wife had just gotten back from a trip. They were out of state and were able to fly into the regional airport south of us, and then had made their way back home. They thankfully live kind of on the main road, and were able to get back, without an issue. And so he calls me first thing on Sunday morning, was like, hey, you want to get over here, if you've not got power, we've got power. And so I loaded up everything and made my way out. And it was such a strange drive, because he lives about 10 minutes away, 5-10 minutes away from me on a good day. The main route to kind of get towards town was totally flooded. The French Broad River, which runs through a lot of western North Carolina, there's a section of it, kind of near my house, maybe 1.5 miles, 2 miles away, and it had flooded over the road and had wound up rising 20 feet by the end of it. And so couldn't get out that way. The back way out is heavily wooded, and so didn't figure that they would have cleared the trees yet. But that was my best bet, was to head out the back way, and it was a slow drive, kind of brushing the side of my car up against fallen trees. Wound up driving underneath of some power lines to where it was touching the top of my car, and then getting out onto a main road. Wound up getting stuck behind a lineman crew, or a lineman truck, and the drive that would normally take 5 or 10 minutes on a good day took an hour and a half. And so that was one of the things that really started to indicate that, okay, this is different. This is not what we thought it was. And then talking to folks, because we were behind this line truck for like I said, an hour, and got out, was talking to some of the other folks who had stopped their cars, and one of the guys was saying, yeah, man, I had to drive an hour and a half just to go get gas, down into South Carolina. And I was like, dude, what are you talking about? He's like, everything up here is cash only, and all of the gas stations are around the block, with lines. And I was like, dude, what is going on? And so as I'm getting over towards my buddy's house, it's really odd, because I'm starting to see the gas stations that have got people just flooding the pumps, and there's bridges that are out, and there are trees that are down, and so all of that is kind of adding into the perspective that I had been missing. And so that was pretty much what Sunday was. I was able to get over to my buddy's place, kind of take a breath. I was able to get on the phone with my family, see where they were at. They were thankfully able to go stay with some other family and kind of get out of the storm. And so that Sunday was kind of just evaluating, where we were at, and seeing how big of a deal it was, and getting a little bit of self-service back, and starting to see those, Hurricane Helene aftermath videos. But yeah, that's what Sunday looked like.
I mean, essentially, for all of you guys that were there and were affected, it was essentially apocalyptic for you guys. Depending on where you're at.
Yeah, depending on where you're at. There were, as I started to kind of drive around more Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we were able to see that, in all honesty, our area was not as heavily impacted as a lot of other areas were. There were kind of 4 main pockets that got hit really hard. One being Chimney Rock and Lake Lure, which is what, all of the all of the worst footage is coming out of Chimney Rock and Lake Lure, because it's got a river that's running directly beside the town. It's all built up right there. River is fast on a good day, and started ripping out those buildings and stuff. So that was one of the areas. Parts of Asheville got hit pretty hard. South Asheville got hit, I guess, the worst. That's where the Biltmore area is. And then Spruce Pine and Burnsville was another highly impacted area, and then Beach Mountain and Banner Elk. Those were kind of the 4 areas that got hit the worst. And so as we're driving around Monday and Tuesday and partially Wednesday, starting to realize that, okay, we didn't get hit as hard as a lot of these other places did. We're just without power, and we're without water, but the buildings are still here.
Sure.
So there's part of that realization happening at that point in time.
So what kind of, I guess at this point, once you've got out and you started looking around, what kind of made you transition into the side where probably a lot of people have seen most recently, where you're actually helping with the community and kind of going to these more affected areas, and kind of take us down that rabbit hole as far as what you saw, why you did what you did, where the routes you went, just kind of paint that picture.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things that I'm very thankful for, I'm pretty open and pretty transparent about it, on Instagram and in previous podcasts, that I'm not former military. I'm not law enforcement or a firefighter. Never have done any of those, I guess, line of duty type jobs. But I do have some pretty neat friends and some pretty cool acquaintances. So the trip going down to Lake Lure, which was one of those highly affected regions, was brought on because of my friend who I was staying at his house, Matt. He's the fire chief of a department called Fairfield Mountain Volunteer Fire Department that is on the southern side of Lake Lure. And so he had been, like I said, out of town and had gotten back into town and wasn't able to get in touch with anybody at his station, down there. And so Thursday rolls around and he said, do you want to come down to Lake Lure and help give these guys a break? Because they had been, what we were assuming was that they had been running back-to-back 24-hour shifts because they didn't have any relief. Relief couldn't get down to them. And so I was like, yeah, absolutely. Let's go. And so we loaded up and didn't know exactly what we were walking into. But we got down there, had to take, again, alternate routes, just because Chimney Rock on the northern side had gotten hit extremely hard. That's where bridges had washed out. There had been landslides, or mudslides rather, and there was no way in from the north side. So we went south and came up around the bottom of the lake. And so we got to the department, and those guys had been run ragged, just by the number of calls, just trying to be proactive and do what they could to help the folks that were in their area. And the fire station was kind of set up in this strange spot where it was adjacent to a resort. So a very wealthy area on Lake Lure. And they'd been trying to help residents doing welfare checks and stuff. And so we got down there, were able to have a couple of the guys go home. Some of the other guys didn't feel like going home. They just wanted to stay. And so we kept doing welfare checks down there. And it was that's how we got down to Lake Lure. And then working up in Spruce Pine and Green Mountain. Again, another set of friends who are well connected asked, hey, do you want to come help? And I said, absolutely. So just really kind of good acquaintances and guys who have a natural bent to go help and to go be of aid. They didn't just want to sit around and do nothing while folks in their state were suffering. And that's it's the type of people that I like to be around. That's the type of people that I like to surround myself with. So I was very thankful for them all reaching out and giving me the opportunity to help where I could.
I think one big thing that we've all learned from this, because I feel like a lot of us get stuck in the doomer mindset a lot, thinking that we're all against each other and that just there's no community anymore. But this has kind of proven that there is still that sense of community and that pride left. It may be a little bit more scarce than we're used to in the past, but it's still there, especially in the heart of Appalachia, where you just have that kind of that sense of belonging and culture that kind of comes with being a part of the mountain folk.
Yeah, there's every day we get inundated with news, with media, about how we're divided and how we're not, what all the differences are and why you shouldn't like other people. But a lot of that, for lack of a better term, bullshit kind of falls away when you've got this giant daunting thing happening. There's really not much of a choice other than to lock arms and to work on, making sure that people are safe, making sure that people are taken care of. I don't think that I saw one person get denied help because they had a Harris Waltz bumper sticker or a Trump Vance bumper sticker. There are times when our differences don't matter as much, if that makes sense.
For sure.
But there's been a lot more of that than there has been negativity, and it's really beneficial. Nobody has time for those differences when you're focused on helping other people. So it's definitely had a lot of pride in seeing the turnout, the amount of support that people have, and just the response. People are caring about other people.
And experience will vary very differently, and anybody that's kind of responded to this disaster will be able to tell you that. But about what time frame do you think you guys finally started to get some outside help from like the civilian and private organization side, not necessarily government, but what
Right.
how many days post disaster was it where the different volunteer search and rescue teams started showing up, the Minuteman style groups, the just random band of people that were like, we're going to go down and help. Just when did that really kind of start coming in the heavier sense?
So the first time that we really started seeing that was maybe Wednesday,
Mm-hmm.
I think. So would have been 6 days after, or well, I think everybody is kind of agreeing that it started on Friday, even though I lost power on Thursday. So it was probably 4 or 5 days from the start where we really started seeing people with just loaded down truck beds, and that's more so what we saw a lot of. I didn't see many of the Minuteman groups turning out. I saw one, and they're one of the groups of guys that I rolled with up to Spruce Pine.
Mm-hmm.
But there was just a lot of good citizens turning out, kind of Wednesday forward, that were bringing in supplies, that were dropping stuff off, bringing formula, bringing water, bringing everything but the kitchen sink. And so that coincided with us showing up to the fire station in Lake Lure on Thursday, and by the time that we got down there, there were already supplies that had been brought into the station,
Mm-hmm.
and a substantial number of supplies, a ton of bottled water, a ton of food, a ton of baby care, whether it was bottles or diapers or formula or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time that we had got down there Thursday, they had already been taking on a substantial number of donations. So it was probably Tuesday or Wednesday, I guess, would have been when those started turning out.
So before we get kind of into the more organized response to everything, we're kind of in the disorganized response phase of all of this. What would you say some of your biggest takeaways would be to people or community organizations or just anybody in the kind of local level?
Yeah, one of the big things that we started realizing was that everybody was showing up with supplies, not just a couple trucks a day, not just one truck at a time, but everyone was turning out with supplies. And it got to the point where we were having to turn stuff away, where it's, sorry, you're going to have to find another department. That was great. That was kind of the best case scenario. One of the things that was happening kind of simultaneously was that because all of those resources were being taken from unaffected areas and being brought to affected areas, was that it was creating kind of a vacuum on the border towns of the unaffected areas. So that was one thing that we saw that might, I would imagine that everybody who has gone through something similar has seen that happen.
Mm-hmm.
Where that vacuum of resources is being pulled into the affected area, out of the unaffected area, and now the unaffected area doesn't have everything that they need. So there was that from the community side. I'll be totally honest. I think that kind of having those handful of down days between me actually losing power and everything starting to the time where I started responding to stuff,
Mm-hmm.
I think that I was just kind of taking it all in and wasn't really all that focused on, okay, well, what does the response look like? What are all of the supplies that are needed?
Sure.
I wasn't bringing supplies, to places. I was in the areas where supplies were being brought to. So I don't think that I've got really a good answer on what advice to give organizations or people, in the very, very early stages, what they could do differently. I don't think I've got a good answer.
One big thing I've taken away from this and some of the other kind of leadership elements of community-based organizations is the importance of information networks. And
Yes.
anybody that has planned, whether it was this disaster or other disasters in the past, have planned responses around these disasters, know that every piece of information you get is definitely not intelligence. Some random person on Instagram that you've spoke with on a few random, occasions giving you information doesn't automatically make it intelligence and worth your organization making response decisions off of that. Um, for myself, we have a lot of, other group contacts and whatnot into Ohio, here in Kentucky, West Virginia, kind of in Pennsylvania. Like this region of the country, we're really solid about. But like for my local organization, trying to come down to Tennessee, North Carolina, we didn't really have any area contacts or contacts that were specifically based around some sort of organization. So it was very hard to make decisions based on the information that you're getting. Because, like I said, not everything is intelligence. Everything is information, but not everything is intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the big things that we were kind of seeing was, everybody was wanting to come out and to help. And I got so many messages, just over the course of a couple of days about, well, where can we go donate to? Who can we, get in touch with? And as somebody who is not, not a part of an organization, that prepares for this type of thing, the best thing that I could tell them was, call emergency management, call the sheriff's office, and call fire departments, and just start, cold calling, because there's North Carolina has a lot of very anti-militia laws, and so any type of civilian organization or civilian first responders or whatever it is, all of that's pretty frowned upon by the state, and that's discouraged a lot of people.
Which is some of those odd.
Well,
from North Carolina. I mean, for those that don't know, North Carolina's politics are not like, they're very different than what you would consider deep South politics. North Carolina is kind of weird in that way.
Yeah, and one of the big reasons that that's the case is that we've got Charlotte, Asheville, and Raleigh. We've got some large population centers that vote, historically blue. And for being a purple state, the politics are definitely weird. We're nothing like South Carolina in regards to their politics. At least we don't have Lindsey Graham, thank God. But that's North Carolina's anti-militia laws were kind of built up. Oh my goodness, I'm going to draw a blank on his name. The gentleman who bombed the abortion clinic and the gay nightclub.
Oh, okay.
It was Eric Rudolph.
Yeah.
Eric Rudolph. That was his name. So Eric Rudolph was protected by a militia in northwest North Carolina. So it was literally a group called the Spartans, because they were based out of Sparta, North Carolina. And so after that, North Carolina started coming down pretty heavily on the militias within the state, and that's been enough to discourage people from having those communication networks or information networks. Anything that kind of resembles anti-government, civilian, whatever, is sketches most people out. So good for you guys that you've got that kind of that information network. What I would pay to have one of those. I've tried establishing one kind of personally, and that's worked out pretty well. But having that information that's coming at you, and then intelligence that you're able to be fed, that makes such a difference.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that kind of the culture and politics on the local level kind of changes in the future in your area of North Carolina after this disaster is behind you guys, as far as kind of the lessons learned and maybe the importance of some of that stuff? Or do you think it's kind of still a lost cause?
I certainly don't want to call it a lost cause. I'm hopeful for what it's gonna bring. I mean, I was cutting trees with my neighbor, who I know pretty well, and he's into guns. Anytime that I'm shooting, he comes out and we talk. He worked for Glock for a while, like just a really, really nice guy. And I was like, listen, man, all that I'm gonna say is that this is what I love. Like seeing people show up and just help each other out. It felt like Little House on the Prairie, where they're raising a barn. Like everybody and their brother has turned out to help clear the road, and there's not a concern about, well, who's coming down the road. It's just, oh, that's your neighbor. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was a massive win, and I'm sure that other people felt the same way. You know, that whether they knew their neighbors or not, whether they're, you know, preparedness minded or not, you know, that they're just encountering people who are willing to help. I think that is probably the biggest win that we're going to take away. And if people started thinking more in terms of like, oh, well, you know, it'd be smart if I had a month's worth of food stocked up. Mm-hmm. It'd be, you know, because that kind of pipeline starts to move very quickly from the, oh, I should have a couple extra cans of soup, to the, you know, oh, well, you know, I know my community. I'm, you know, well-respected person, you know, in good standing with my community, and I like guns and I'm into this. All of the other preparedness stuff is pretty easy to sell people on if they just kind of accept the first part, which is, you know, well, it'd be better to have a couple extra things on hand.
Sure.
So I'm hopeful for how it turns out, but we're not going to know for a while.
So just for the audience's perspective, and I won't share a ton of details just because we've chosen not to, and I never say who I'm with, but anybody that's paid attention long enough, it can put the two together. We responded down to East Tennessee, and kind of what you talked about as far as like the vacuum of resources between border areas of disaster areas. We had a completely different experience in Tennessee. So we went down to East Tennessee, and we got down there on a Friday night. And as we're driving towards the affected area, we're like, all right, we're 20 minutes from where, you know, our staging location is supposed to be, which is right on the disaster line. Like, this is going to start looking like a little weird. And as we're kind of closing in on this area, nothing has changed. Like, the roads completely fine, restaurants packed, people at the movie theaters, you know, gas was $2.50, you know, like all the power's on. And as we get closer and closer and closer and closer, that just kept being the normal. And I was like, this is really weird. Like, we expected to come and find like this immediate disaster area with like a lot of like wide scale effect, but it wasn't that way. Like in East Tennessee, it very much was, here is the disaster line. Everything on this side is destroyed. Everything on this side is business as normal. It was like a definitive line. It was very weird.
Huh.
It sounds like you kind of had waves or stages of kind of the disaster, but this was different. I mean, it was quite literally just like disaster this side, business as normal on this side.
Right. Yeah, that is entirely different. I mean, we had areas, well, it might have been that we lost power essentially everywhere. Mm-hmm. There were two towns that are kind of close to me, neither of which lost power. Both of those towns having kind of been built up on hills. Mm-hmm. So we attributed that they, you know, maintained power because they weren't close to the river or, you know, whatever else. So I think that the widespread power outage definitely contributed to making more places feel like they were a part of the affected area.
Sure.
Now, the heavily affected areas, there was more of a line. So Chimney Rock and Lake Lure there's essentially one way in, one way out. Both of those points had checkpoints with not your average beat cop, like actual security at both of the entrances. But that was kind of the extreme. Now, there were a bunch of other areas because it's a rural pastoral part of Western North Carolina where there was flooding in everyone's fields. Mm-hmm. You know, there was a ton of water everywhere. There were trees that had been ripped up, trees just down across the road everywhere. And so it definitely seems like it was more random as far as where the quote-unquote disaster was, opposed to, well, drive right up to the line and the disasters on that side and what's not part of the disasters on this side. So it definitely sounds like you guys had a little bit different experience in Tennessee than we did out here.
Yeah. I mean, on the North Carolina side of the border, once volunteers were able to get into the area, and I know it seemed like it was relatively difficult for outside volunteers to get into these affected areas because security checkpoints were eventually set up, and people have different opinions on this kind of stuff. But once volunteers were in the affected areas, dealing with local officials or other just local groups that had kind of self-established after the disaster and made up of locals, were the outside responders kind of, welcomed with open arms, and, was it a more positive light, or was there kind of a bit of, hesitation and kind of like, I don't know about this type thing?
For me personally, and again, experiences may vary, it was far more of the open arms. And again, it might have to do with being attached to people or working with people who are supposed to be there. And so it looked a lot less like disaster tourism opposed to actually wanting to come and help. So, but by and large, from the other people that I've talked with, there was a lot more welcoming of volunteers with open arms, whether it was, hey, you've got this truck full of supplies, here's an address, see if you can get there, and being sent off to go drop off supplies at rural fire stations or rural distribution centers. So it seemed to me, and again, like I said, experiences may vary, that there was a lot more receptiveness to outside volunteers than there was in your experience.
Yeah. And our experience in Tennessee wasn't necessarily bad. We were welcomed with open arms, kind of the professionalism that our organization carries ourselves. Everyone was kind of glad to have us there. We just didn't get utilized in any way, and it's hard not to go down that rabbit hole. But we definitely didn't. All of the people we talked to, NGOs, government, federal government, local government, civilian populace, like, we really didn't meet anybody that was like, "Why are you here?" or "Go away, get out of our city" type thing. Like, we never ran into that. Everyone was fairly positive and open arms. Just the other side of the experience was less than ideal.
Right.
And that was a really weird thing to have, to be so welcomed and like, like, "Oh, thank you for coming," and just essentially not get used. You're like, this is weird.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I can imagine.
Makes for very awkward table talk, and probably from the outsider's perspective, because obviously I'm not from these affected areas. It's weird from our perspective coming outside of our AO to these affected areas, because we are not from there. Unless you're directly meeting up with somebody you don't know, you don't necessarily have rapport. So you can't necessarily throw your weight around as much as you would be able to in your own AO. Because if you're in your own AO and, somebody from EMA or FEMA is like, "Hey, don't do that," you could be like, "Screw you, this is my home. Like, I'm going to do what I want." But if you go to somebody else's AO, that's not how it works. Like, you gotta play the game, and you gotta
much more minding your P's and Q's and not stepping on toes. And
two very separate sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of people, even in Tennessee, that found success. I'm glad those people were able to make the connections. This definitely seemed like a big, and like I said before, it kind of goes back to the networking thing. Like, it just goes to show you like how important networking is with people, and being able to establish reliable sources of information.
Yeah, it really is. And the point that you bring up about, coming from outside of the AO to, to somewhere else that you're not familiar with. I saw some people who were getting, for lack of a better term, offended that they were being turned away. It's like, okay, well, thank you, Bob, for stopping by and volunteering. And we get that you were with the volunteer fire department 20 years ago, and now you're in your 80s. Like, we don't have much that you can do. But for a lot of those places, taking on the liability of outside help with someone that you can't vet, someone that, absolutely nothing about, it's not the move. These areas already do have first responders, with fire, with EMT, with, cops, trying to step in and be like, oh, well, I was a cop or I was a firefighter. It's like, cool, but, we've got our own. So I can see that side of it, and I can see why some people would get turned away, but there's still plenty to do, whether it's, having a guy lug cases of water and put them in people's trunks and send them on their way. There's always work to be had, but it was interesting to see some people get frustrated with not being able to quote unquote be a help.
Sure. And it's kind of goes back to a 9/11 documentary I watched very recently with the passing holiday. We were watching a bunch of them around the firehouse, and it talked about how a lot of firemen who were retired were just like flooding these New York firehouses, people that were 75, 80 years old, and they're like, I'm here to help. And it's like, that's awesome. Glad you still have the pride and like all that kind of stuff. But it's like, you are no help right now.
Right. Right.
You could stay here at the station and like answer the phone and stuff if you want, but like I can't send you down there. You're 78 years old and have chronic heart failure. Like I can't send you there. So
yeah,
it's definitely an interesting kind of realm of conversation, and it's why I tell people that one, these kind of local community-based, volunteer response organizations are so important, and you carry yourselves in such a professional manner because you can get to the point where you are getting involved with your local EMA, with your local firehouses and whatnot, and kind of have a seat at the table for this kind of planning stuff if you do your homework correctly, if you set up your pieces on the chessboard correctly. You can be an asset for that, and you could be the individual that's tasked with dealing with all of the outside volunteers. If you don't want volunteers to be turned away, you need to be that force that steps forward and says, hey, we'll give us tasks and we'll manage all the volunteers. We'll make sure stuff gets done. That type of stuff is important because people like your local EMA, who's normally just some retired fire chief or fired police chief, has a million other things going on dealing with already the loads of firemen and policemen and all that kind of stuff. They can't be right. There's only so much they can handle.
Yeah. And that brings up another really good point, which is that having a seat at that table takes work beforehand.
Oh, yeah.
That doesn't happen as the disaster. I mean, I know that you and I both get that, but for anybody who's listening like that, you're not going to walk up and be like, oh, I'll help with all the volunteers. It's like, no, dude, nobody knows you. And so having that rapport, being a well thought of individual in your community, such a big deal. That's one thing that you can't buy. It's not the latest drop from chestrigcompany.org. Like, it is something that you do have to dedicate time and effort into, beforehand, so that you're as effective as you can be, in the moment. So hopefully it's something, that people will think about and that they'll be encouraged afterwards to go do something like that. It's, I definitely plan to talk with emergency management in my county and see, if there is anything that I can do, and start building that relationship, because that's one of those things that you really don't know the holes in your game until you play it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that I've got to learn from this.
And, me and my organization, we just had to sit down with our county EMA literally today, this afternoon. And it was planned before this disaster, but, kind of going down to Tennessee and our experience dealing with them and whatnot just happened to be a good precursor to meeting with our own county EMA and taking on the more, official kind of route of trying to be a help.
Yeah.
And those type of people are glad to hear you out and sit down with you, and so long as you've got something good putting forward at the project table, a lot of them are really going to take things on with a smile and a positive attitude. But if you go in just kind of goofy, no real purpose, disorganized, they're gonna be like, all right, they'll entertain your conversation for a little bit and send you on your way.
Right. Yeah, as they should.
Yeah. 'Cause you can't just tolerate too much silliness.
No, gotta be professional. Gotta have, I mean, that's one of the big things. So I grew up with a very, very Italian dad and a very Italian grandfather, and that was the one big thing that they would, you only got one name, and it's your name, so you better make sure that there's something good associated with it. and that, kind of professionalism that people bring, speaks well of them. It speaks well of the people that, they keep company with. And so I would imagine I'd pay a lot of money to be a fly on the wall in that meeting with your EMA.
It was definitely a very productive conversation. It was probably a little overdue. A lot of the guys
Yeah.
have been hesitant, as most civilian organizations are, because you don't want to be put on the radar. But
right,
the world's just such a weird place now where you've got to start, reading the writing on the wall and taking the steps that you need to.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're kind of sitting at, I would say, day 16, day 17 now from really, the clock was at 0 from you guys. What is the state of things down there right now? What is the reality?
So patterns of life are returning to normal in a lot of areas. And that is kind of to be expected. The unaffected areas, life goes on, as normal. You can go to McDonald's, grab a cheeseburger, get gas, use your card for everything. But that's for some of the busier areas. The more rural areas, the trees are still down. They're cut up and just pushed off to the side of the road until somebody pulls them away, for firewood. Mm-hmm. Power is by and large restored. I think that I had read something which was that 90% of affected people have got their power back on. Now, how much I believe that, is up for debate. I think that was Jeff Jackson, who is one of the congressmen for Western North Carolina, and I think that's the statistic that his office was using, was that 90% of homes have had power restored. But I've got people that I work with that they still don't have power, they still don't have water, 16, 17 days in. And but it's very kind of it's just varied. It's extremely varied, because it would skip, some valleys and then hit other valleys harder. And so there's not much rhyme or reason as to why some areas got hit harder than others, outside of, what is the term? What the weathermen have to say about it, or meteorologists. That's the word that I'm looking for. What meteorological reason, that's not even a word, what reasons there are that some areas got hit harder than others. There's just not any that I'm aware of, but things are kind of getting back to normal for some areas. Some areas have been told that they'd be 5 to 6 months without electricity, and without water. And so it's just extremely, extremely varied.
I definitely feel like the road to recovery in a lot of these places is long, because anybody that knows anything about construction, rebuilding these areas of the mountains that is a logistical task.
It is, and one of the other big things that's being discussed currently is the infrastructure and how things are supposed to get rebuilt. So I'm sure with you being from Ohio and the few mountains that you guys have up there, you've got part of Appalachia up there.
Whoa.
But
from Kentucky.
Oh, from Kentucky, like from. Gotcha.
I'm no Yankee.
Okay, good to know. My apologies. I should have asked for clarification first.
That's okay.
But so one of the big things with mountain infrastructure is that a lot of stuff really gets based heavily around rivers, because the easiest way to build a road is to follow the river. And we've really just seen how that plays out with a once in 1,000-year flood happening. So that's how things get rebuilt is kind of a question mark in a lot of areas. If things get rebuilt is a question mark in a lot of areas as well. Like with Chimney Rock, there's not really much of a way to salvage the homes that were there. There's not, when your home is in the lake or in the river, It's not really a question of rebuilding. It's of, well, where do you go? So there's a lot that's kind of surrounding that. I will be honest, as far as my kind of biggest fear through all of this is corporate entities coming in and buying up the land, writing a $60,000 check and saying, thank you.
Sure.
That's the one thing that I am concerned about. But the tenacity of the people who live in the area is not up for debate. It's not a question. These people want to stay here. These people want to rebuild. How you go about doing that, is it's a big conversation.
Sure. No, and I think a lot of us see it all over the country, is that unfortunately a lot of corporations kind of bully their way into rural areas and either buy you out or eventually push you out.
Yeah.
I just hope that doesn't happen for this area of the country.
I certainly hope not as well. I mean, it's one of the more difficult things to fight against, if that makes sense. But there's everyone has had a tremendous amount to give, kind of in this first 2-week period of time. But we're going to have a week number 4. We're going to have a week number 30. We're going to have 2 years from now. And the help and support that people have been, currently, that's still going to be needed. Volunteers are going to be needed to take supplies, to help rebuild stuff, but also stuff like legal help, help with knowing how to keep your property, how to keep your home, and to not give in to, those corporate entities that might come along. And I'm not saying that they are currently, but there's definitely a lot of help that people are going to need for a very long time, and it's very multifaceted as far as what they're going to be needing.
Oh man, long road ahead. That's for sure.
Yeah.
What is there any other kind of like big ticket things you wish you would have done, things you wish you would have known, like any other just kind of general pieces of advice you'd have for people?
Not really. I mean, there's a handful of things that I wish that I did differently, that I'll probably write up at some point. Keeping cash with you. I run into a bad habit of just using a card and not keeping cash on me. But that, keeping cash on hand, smart, having just some simple stuff at home, stuff that you normally eat, having extra water stored. There's so many just really simple things that you can do to put yourself ahead, not ahead of other people, but to better off your situation. By just thinking ahead. And those are a couple big ones. The one thing that I will say that I was super, super, super happy about was just seeing the number of guys coming out to help. That's really heartwarming. And the number of guys who went about it in the right way. Guys who are showing up, with chainsaws, with shovels, with, things that are appropriate for the situation. That was huge. Not guys trying to, come out and wear their best drip and have their camo on and plate carriers. I didn't see any of that happening, which I know that some folks have done that, in the past with disasters, and that's just not the right way to go about it.
Sure.
We got to a point where one of the guys at the fire station said, if everybody could just put up your handgun, you can keep it on you, just don't let other people see it because it's starting to weird people out. And just having that much situational awareness to see how you're coming across to the people that you're trying to help. Stuff like that is huge, but that's kind of the biggest things, going about things in a healthy way, focusing on just genuinely helping people, opposed to what it's going to do to benefit you. The number of people who have just come out and given of themselves has been so encouraging, and it's been such a blessing. And you know, we certainly don't want to be greedy in asking for more of that, but that's what's going to be needed for a lot of these communities, are people to help, people to fight for them, to advocate for them. And like I said previously, you know, that looks like a lot of different things. It can be legal help for, you know, how they can take care of their home, how they can work with their insurance, actual volunteers to come out and help rebuild things, you know, later on down the road. And then people to just continue to do the good work that they're doing in taking supplies out to rural areas that, you know, can't get out, or that don't have anywhere else to go. So there's an awful lot that's been done really well with this, and with the relief efforts. And I'm just incredibly proud of the people in my community, the people, you know, of Western North Carolina have by and large, you know, taken it in stride and just kept moving forward. So
awesome. Well, Nick, I greatly appreciate you coming on and kind of sharing your story and kind of some brief after action thoughts. Obviously, this nobody foresaw this coming, so it's definitely one of those big things where it's like you better learn from mistakes and learn to kind of better prepare for this scenario now, because it's not like you're going to get very many chances before it happens again.
Oh yeah, dude, we're going to be so ready for the next 1,000-year flood. I mean, there's seriously.
Yeah, it's hopefully it doesn't happen for another 1,000 years.
I certainly hope not. I'm tired of once in a lifetime events personally, but yeah, we just keep taking it in stride.
We've definitely enough for my liking.
Yeah, that makes two of us.
All right. Anything else you want to add, man? Or are we ready to wrap this up?
Oh, I think that we're ready to wrap it up. I really appreciate you, having me on, reaching out, and giving me the time to talk about it. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming on, man.
Oh,
all right,
appreciate
guys.
It.
That's all I've got for episode 37, Hurricane Helene. As always, train hard, train often.
Tell me turn it down and I'ma only turn up louder. Call me what you wanna, but you can't call me no coward. Straight the numbers, we the people, still the ones with power. Fighting fire with fire, time to take back what is ours. Tell me turn it down